The psychology of indifference as control, power, avoidance, and emotional detachment. Indifference, especially in response to conflict, rejection, or boundary setting, is often mistaken for neutrality or maturity. In reality, it is frequently a form of covert control. The silent withdrawal, the absence of engagement, or the refusal to acknowledge emotional shifts is not passive. It's a calculated or unconscious behavioral mechanism grounded in psychological patterns such as emotional avoidance, narcissistic tendencies, insecure attachment, and dominance preservation in social hierarchies. Emotional detachment versus emotional immaturity. People who display manipulative indifference often lack emotional integration. They may appear regulated, calm, rational, unaffected, but what's actually happening is suppression. This is often tied to dismissive avoidant attachment styles, where individuals minimize or devalue emotions as a self-protective strategy learned early in environments where vulnerability was unsafe or ignored. They are not neutral. They are emotionally disengaged in a way that preserves their ego and reduces their perceived exposure to threat. Their detachment becomes a tool. By not responding, they implicitly assert psychological dominance, indifference as a social power tool. In group settings, indifference functions as soft exclusion. It is a form of social control: who is acknowledged, who is not, who is involved, who is sidelined. The person exhibiting indifference typically holds or seeks informal social capital and wields it subtly. They may lead group plans, initiate threads, and ignore the presence or absence of individuals who don't conform to their expectations. This creates a power differential without overt confrontation. This is not unconscious. At the very least, it is semi-conscious. People who operate this way often have an intuitive grasp of dominance structures and use non-response to destabilize others. The silence is loaded with implication. You are not important enough to address. Cognitive dissonance and control. For many of these individuals, acknowledging another's emotional reality creates cognitive dissonance. It threatens their internal narrative of being good, fair, rational, or above drama. To avoid this dissonance, they externalize blame and internalize control. Silence becomes the weapon of least resistance. It allows them to avoid the discomfort of emotional complexity while reinforcing their moral or intellectual superiority. Narcissistic and borderline traits. In some cases, indifference is linked to narcissistic strategies. While overt narcissists may seek attention through grandiosity, covert narcissists often rely on silence, withdrawal, and emotional coldness to retain power. The goal is still control, but the method is subtle erasure. Borderline individuals, in contrast, may swing between idealization and devaluation. Their indifference is less calculated and more reactive, stemming from overwhelm or fear of engulfment. However, when indifference is sustained and strategic, it is more often tied to narcissistic or avoidant traits than borderline reactivity. Language of indifference, passive aggression without words. There's a recognizable pattern in how indifferent individuals communicate: failure to respond to messages while remaining active in group contexts, changing the subject when confronted with interpersonal issues, reframing disengagement as maturity or emotional intelligence. Selective acknowledgement of others to control group cohesion and hierarchy. This is behavioral communication, and it's powerful. People read exclusion intuitively. In evolutionary psychology, rejection or omission by the group was once a survival threat. That legacy persists neurologically today. Indifference activates the pain centers of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, the same regions triggered by physical pain. The brain doesn't separate social pain from bodily harm. That's why this form of silent manipulation is so effective and so damaging. The neuroscience of emotional withholding. When someone is on the receiving end of indifference, especially if they have a background of relational trauma, the amygdala triggers a threat response. Indifference as a behavioral strategy often develops in individuals with underdeveloped emotional regulation systems. Rather than confronting emotional conflict directly, these individuals default to disengagement. This disengagement is not always conscious, but is reinforced over time because it allows them to maintain control while avoiding the perceived vulnerability of direct communication. From a cognitive behavioral perspective, the behavior is reinforced by its outcome. Silence yields power without the discomfort of confrontation. This detachment can also be understood through the lens of personality structure. Individuals with traits leaning toward narcissistic or avoidant personality profiles tend to prioritize self-image and psychological insulation over mutual understanding. By withholding emotional engagement, they create asymmetry. The other party is left activated, thinking, feeling, questioning, while the indifferent individual maintains a dissociated neutrality. This one-sided activation creates a dynamic where the emotionally engaged person expends cognitive energy trying to repair or interpret, effectively shifting the social power in the interaction. In neurobiological terms, this dynamic activates the limbic system in the person on the receiving end. Their threat response is triggered due to ambiguity and relational unpredictability, leading to heightened cortisol levels and impaired executive functioning. The indifferent individual, meanwhile, remains underactivated, avoiding limbic engagement entirely. This contrast in neurological arousal creates a disproportionate psychological burden, particularly in individuals with pre-existing trauma histories or anxious attachment styles. In evolutionary terms, group exclusion or social indifference was once associated with loss of protection or status, so the psychological alarm system is evolutionarily justified. The anterior cingulate cortex processes this exclusion similarly to physical injury. That's why being ignored or emotionally invalidated has such a visceral effect. The behavior, while subtle, carries a significant neurological and psychological toll. Indifference is also an efficient form of behavioral dominance. It allows a person to maintain a sense of control without appearing openly aggressive. In organizational or social hierarchies, the person using indifference rarely appears as the antagonist. Instead, they may be viewed as calm, stable, or above conflict. This is a strategic social position. It minimizes accountability while maximizing influence. In terms of communication theory, this behavior aligns with high-context power maneuvers. Rather than using overt verbal cues, the indifferent person communicates through absence. The omission becomes the message. In this context, silence is not neutral, it's structured and deliberate, meant to shift emotional labor and relational initiative onto the other party. Additionally, individuals who rely on indifference often resist feedback. Because their identity is tied to emotional detachment as a strength, they may pathologize those who seek connection, labeling them as dramatic, needy, or too emotional. This defense mechanism protects them from internal dissonance. It is easier to dismiss the other as unstable than to acknowledge one's own emotional limitations. Over time, repeated use of indifference can lead to relational breakdown, group fragmentation, or erosion of trust within social systems. But because the behavior lacks clear aggression, the individual employing it rarely faces direct consequences. The social structure may continue to function, but beneath the surface, it becomes fractured as others learn to self-censor or withdraw to avoid exclusion. Indifference, when used strategically or habitually, is not benign. It is a relational behavior with measurable neurological, psychological, and social impact. It maintains power, avoids vulnerability, and shifts emotional labor onto others, all while preserving the illusion of composure. In social psychology, indifference functions as a form of social sanction. Unlike overt punishment, which involves confrontation, indifference operates through withdrawal of attention, signaling disapproval or devaluation without engaging in conflict. This is particularly effective in tight-knit social groups where belonging is a core motivator. The indifferent party leverages this dynamic by subtly excluding others, forcing them to recalibrate behavior to regain inclusion. The mechanism mirrors operant conditioning. Attention is withheld until the target modifies their actions. This behavioral reinforcement loop serves two psychological purposes. First, it reasserts the power of the indifferent individual within the group hierarchy. Second, it trains the excluded individual to avoid behaviors that might trigger further social distancing. The result is compliance driven by avoidance, not agreement, not understanding, but fear of rejection. In terms of developmental psychology, this behavior often originates in early environments where emotional expression was unsafe, ignored, or punished. Children raised in such environments learn to cope by suppressing affect and minimizing vulnerability. As adults, they continue this strategy by disengaging when emotional intensity arises, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of conditioned avoidance. Indifference, in this framework, becomes a default regulatory mechanism. However, the external impact of this internal regulation strategy is relational harm. Emotional needs go unmet. Dialogue is replaced by ambiguity. Emotional feedback loops are short-circuited, preventing resolution, growth, or repair. In repeated patterns, this can lead to what is termed relational fatigue. In the person on the receiving end, a cognitive and emotional exhaustion that results from repeated one-sided efforts to connect or clarify. Culturally, indifference is often valorized. In many Western contexts, detachment is associated with professionalism, stoicism, or self-control. The phrase, "don't let them see you sweat," encapsulates a value system in which emotional withholding is conflated with strength. This cultural norm further protects those who weaponize indifference, insulating them from critique and legitimizing their avoidance behaviors. Yet, from a systems theory perspective, chronic indifference destabilizes interpersonal ecosystems. It introduces noise into communication systems, disrupts feedback mechanisms, and undermines cohesion. Even when it appears functional on the surface, it creates a low-trust environment that suppresses authenticity and reduces the capacity for meaningful collaboration. On an individual level, the use of indifference can be adaptive in short bursts, such as in situations requiring emotional containment. However, when used habitually or strategically, it ceases to regulate and begins to dominate. It becomes not a coping mechanism, but a control mechanism. And control that is not disclosed is coercion. What makes this form of control particularly insidious is its plausible deniability. Because indifference is a lack of action, the person employing it can always deny intent. "I was just busy. I didn't see it. I didn't know you were waiting for a response." This creates an epistemic imbalance, where one party has experience, emotional impact, but the other denies knowledge, intent, making accountability nearly impossible. In summary, indifference as a behavioral pattern represents a blend of avoidance, control, and power retention, deeply embedded in psychological development and cultural validation. Its effects are measurable across cognitive, emotional, and social domains, often leaving long-term relational damage that goes unacknowledged because the act itself is framed as nothing at all. This behavioral phenomenon also intersects with the concept of emotional labor. When one party engages in chronic indifference, the burden of maintaining or repairing the relationship shifts disproportionately onto the other person. That individual must initiate contact, manage emotional tone, interpret silence, and often suppress their own emotional needs to avoid further withdrawal. Over time, this creates a skewed emotional economy in which one person contributes the majority of relational effort while the other exerts passive control by doing less or nothing at all. From the perspective of affect theory, indifference inhibits the effective exchange necessary for mutual regulation. Human interaction depends on feedback loops, facial expressions, tone, acknowledgement, mirroring. Indifference breaks these loops. The indifferent individual becomes a closed system, refusing to metabolize or return emotional input. This non-responsiveness reduces the relationship's capacity for adaptation, learning, or repair. It results in emotional stagnation, not neutrality. In attachment theory terms, this can be understood as deactivating strategies. Individuals with dismissive avoidant attachment often suppress attachment needs both in themselves and in others. When confronted with proximity, intimacy, or emotional demands, they retreat into psychological distance. Indifference is not the absence of emotion. It is the suppression of emotion to avoid perceived dependence or vulnerability. Ironically, this very suppression enacts a form of control, as it places the emotionally engaged person in a position of dependence, waiting for response or re-engagement. Sociolinguistically, silence in this context operates as a marked form of communication. Although nothing is said, the lack of acknowledgement becomes a meaningful act. It signals withdrawal of recognition, which in turn alters the social identity of the other. The excluded person is not merely being ignored, they are being reframed socially as non-essential. This has implications for group identity, especially in tight social networks where visibility and inclusion are equated with value. In digital communication environments, such as group chats or social media, indifference manifests through non-response, selective acknowledgement, or performative inclusion that masks exclusion. The platform's structure, read receipts, visibility indicators, asynchronous timing, adds complexity to the dynamic. The ambiguity created by digital silence allows the indifferent individual to plausibly deny exclusion while still exercising psychological power. They control not only what is said, but when and if anything is said at all. The long-term relational effects of repeated exposure to indifference include increased emotional vigilance, cognitive fatigue, and identity destabilization. When interpersonal cues become inconsistent or absent, the brain works overtime to interpret possible meanings. This interpretive overdrive is cognitively costly. It reduces mental clarity, diminishes relational security, and heightens anxiety. In some cases, it may contribute to complex post-traumatic stress patterns, especially if the individual has a history of unpredictable or emotionally distant caregivers. Ultimately, indifference functions as a high-efficiency, low-visibility method of relational control. It demands little effort, leaves minimal evidence, and yet produces significant psychological impact. It allows the user to avoid accountability while maintaining authority, and it transfers emotional burden onto the target without explicit confrontation. This makes it not only effective, but also difficult to challenge, especially in social systems that reward composure and penalize emotional expression. The psychological motivation behind chronic indifference is rooted in several overlapping internal processes, most of which serve to protect the individual's sense of self and control. The first and most foundational is emotional self-preservation. For individuals with limited capacity for affect regulation, indifference is a form of insulation. They do not have the emotional tools to process conflict, nuance, or relational complexity, so they neutralize the environment by disengaging. This creates the illusion of stability, but it is actually rigidity, control through simplification. Secondly, chronic indifference often masks unprocessed shame. Shame is a threat to the internal narrative of being competent, moral, or in control. To avoid it, individuals externalize responsibility and deactivate empathy. If someone expresses hurt, the indifferent person reflexively distances rather than engages. They subconsciously interpret emotional feedback as accusation, which they cannot tolerate. This defense mechanism allows them to preserve a fragile ego structure while avoiding introspection. The result is a behavioral loop in which any perceived vulnerability in the other is met with coolness, silence, or feigned neutrality. Third, individuals who rely on indifference often internalize hierarchical social schemas. They see relationships in terms of dominance and submission, inclusion and exclusion, centrality and marginality. Their goal is not connection, but status preservation. They do not engage relationally. They manage perception. Within this framework, indifference becomes a form of gatekeeping. Who gets access to attention, who receives acknowledgement, and who is left outside the boundary of relevance. For these individuals, indifference is not just emotional detachment, it is social stratification applied interpersonally. They may not articulate it, but their behavior reflects a need to preserve their position by minimizing relational uncertainty. Anyone who threatens that certainty by asking for accountability, asserting a boundary, or withdrawing from the dynamic is met with erasure. This maintains the internal order and reinforces their unchallenged role as the one who decides who matters. Breaking the cycle of manipulative indifference requires disrupting the power asymmetry it depends on. The behavior is only effective when the recipient internalizes the silence as meaningful, threatening, or deserved. Once that interpretive frame is removed, the leverage collapses. The indifferent individual relies on the other party to seek re-engagement, reassurance, or resolution. If none of that occurs, if the silence is met with silence or neutrality, the mechanism fails. From a behavioral standpoint, this is extinction. When a response no longer yields control or attention, it loses its function. The indifferent party may escalate briefly through subtle barbs, indirect re-engagement, or social triangulation, but the absence of reinforcement eventually forces recalibration. Their power lies not in the act of disengagement itself, but in its reception. When the target no longer absorbs the emotional cost, the strategy becomes irrelevant. Emotionally literate individuals are more immune to this dynamic because they are trained to identify manipulation as a signal of limitation. not power. They do not interpret emotional withholding as a reflection of their worth, but as a reflection of the other's psychological avoidance. This reframing breaks the dependency loop and redirects emotional energy towards self-regulation and boundary clarity. In systems with high emotional maturity, personal, organizational, or communal, indifference is often flagged early. Silence is not seen as neutral, but as an interruption in feedback. These systems use inquiry, not assumption, and are structured around mutual visibility. In such environments, manipulative indifference is rendered both ineffective and socially transparent. In conclusion, indifference is not a neutral absence of engagement, it is a psychologically complex, socially potent, and often unacknowledged method of control rooted in avoidance, hierarchy, and emotional immaturity. While difficult to confront directly due to its passive structure, its effects are concrete: cognitive strain, emotional ambiguity, and relational erosion. Its antidote is clarity: clarity of self-worth, clarity of relational expectations, and clarity of the behavioral patterns that seek to obscure power behind silence. The long-term relational effects of repeated exposure to indifference include increased emotional vigilance, cognitive fatigue, and identity destabilization. When interpersonal cues become inconsistent or absent, the brain works overtime,